Stories of an Aircraft Builder.
1993. That was actually a nice year. Now we have to jump back in time again, so that I can also tell you this story. After the triplane was finished, I wrote down my work and summarized it in my first big book about the triplane. And in doing so, I stepped on the toes of one or two people. That was not my intention at all. You have to remember that I was 18 when I started working on my book, and that it was published in 1993, when I was just 21 years old and a young man full of enthusiasm and ideals. In order to understand the subsequent little adventure that this book entailed and my reaction to what came next, I would like to briefly tell you that I produced this book myself in a very small edition of 50 copies. And when I say I made it myself, I mean it in the technical sense. In general, the texts for books are written by people who deal with the subject matter, compile, evaluate and discuss documents, and perhaps put together what will be in the book. In most cases, the scope and content are discussed and contractually agreed with the publishing house beforehand, so that the text can then be written. Sometimes a rough draft or a manuscript may already be available from the author. These collected documents are then sent to the publisher, where they are incorporated into the book's production process. There's the editor, the graphic designer, the typesetter, the printer, the bookbinder, later the distributor, and many others who are involved in the completion of the book. A huge effort. In my case, it was different. I did everything myself, and when I say everything, I mean everything. My publishing house was only connected to a print shop insofar as we had several photocopiers. The design was done on the computers available at the time. I didn't have any graphics programs. The pages were printed out and photos and graphics were stuck in the appropriate places. I also drew many of the graphics for my book myself. These templates in A4 format were then taken and arranged in such a way that 4 sheets were arranged so that when folded together they formed a block of 4 sheets to 8 pages. This was then photocopied again and reduced in size, so that the book ended up in A5 format. Of course, the quality of the photographs in particular was not the best, but that was not my concern. I left that to others in terms of the concept. There were enough authors and publishers whose books intended to be based on high quality illustrations. From the outset, I was concerned with the knowledge content. I consider this point to be important in order to be able to properly classify what is to come. These individual blocks of 8 pages were then stitched one after the other to vertically stretched cords in a booklet drawer. I'm speaking figuratively and in layman's terms, so that someone unfamiliar with the subject can imagine it. So my book had 830 pages in blocks of 4 sheets to form 8 pages. So that's 104 such page blocks, with 13 stitches each. That is 1,352 stitches per book, or 67,600 stitches for all 50 hand-bound books. This is not the end to the book, as the spine, end paper, book edges, embossing, capital, and finally the cover are still to be made. I don't want to give a course on bookbinding here. I just want to make it clear that I didn't just write a book, which is a great achievement in itself for an 18-year-old, but that I bound each of these 50 books myself with a lot of love and craftsmanship and have grown to love them. I was, and I'm very proud of this. I was never interested in earning money with the 50 books and the 120 German marks for which I offered them at the time. It was not even close to a price that would cover the effort involved. That should be obvious to everyone, and that's what I thought at the time. But it wasn't like that at all. Envy and the offended vanity of others brought it all about. And that's the story now. The content of my book should cover everything that had to do with the triplane, and so I had the idea, just for the sake of completeness, to list in chapter 15 the individual lives of the triplanes as far as I know them, including photographs. This small and incidental part of my publication then became the bone of contention. Something that was so insignificant to me personally on the overall context, which was about the technology of the aircraft, got someone so angry that he thought he had to punish me by trying to give me the nickname Copycat Engels as a stamp of approval. It didn't work, of course, but the story is as exciting as it is entertaining. As in every specialist area, there are experts in this field too. In most cases, people know each other somehow. It's no different here, of course. There are many aviation historians, both here and abroad, and it's not easy to attract new talent to the cause. However, it was always important to me to somehow establish that I was not primarily concerned with historical context or even with the stories about individual pilots or fighter squadrons, or their use of the aircraft in the field, or even their paintwork by the pilots, but purely with the technology. I didn't want to write about airplanes. I wanted to build them and research and preserve the knowledge of their structural design. The book I wrote was a means to an end, to preserve this knowledge and show it to interested parties in a compact form. It was never intended to be an end in itself, but to be seen as part of the bigger picture. But those historians with whom I clashed probably saw it differently. Of course, I'm not the only one who deals with the technology. There are others, both abroad and in Germany also, but they rarely write books. Historians are known to the public as authors of books, such as Peter Kilduff, Alex Imrie, Paul Lehman, Peter Gross, Floyd Gibbons, Henry Hagener, Alfred Well, Jörg Armin Kranzow, Volker Kroos. I can't list them all. We know some of us personally, but all of them at least through correspondence or through their deeds and works. My dearest and best friend of all is Manfred Thiemeyer, and that was ironic. I can't stand him at all, but not from a professional point of view, because there's nothing or hardly anything to criticize about him, but from a human point of view, because he behaved impossibly towards me. When I was writing my book, I naturally had contact with Alex Imrie, Paul Lehman and Peter Gross beforehand. I told them all what I had in mind. I didn't really notice Manfred Thiemeyer at the time. He seemed to keep himself hidden. In a phone call with Alex Imrie, I told him about him. He told me about him and suggested I get in touch with him. I did because I wanted to hear other people's opinions. As a young person, you want to develop further and are happy to get help from the old hands who you think would be happy to see new blood. So I got in touch and we had a few fruitful conversations on the phone. However, his advice always reminded me to slow down. You have to do decades of research and evaluate everything before you publish it. In retrospect, I knew why he always put this forward. In a way, I understood what he wanted, but it's the mistakes you make that drive you forward. And you can also wait until someone else has done it. So I wrote my book and put it together, and when it was finished, I asked him to look it over. I wasn't dependent on him or bound by instructions. I don't think he understood what I meant when I invited him over to discuss my finished book. We arranged to meet, and he visited me at my home in Schondorf, where we sat and drank coffee and talked. He probably expected the finished manuscript to be handed to him for review or something similar, so that he could add his own 2 cents. I also personally had the impression that he thought I would now pay him for his review and then mention it when it went to print. I remember his face and how his jaw dropped when I presented him with 50 ready-bound books. He picked up the copy I showed him and leafed through it. I mistook his horror for admiring and amazement. God, I was naive. The man seemed impressed, but was so shocked to be holding a finished book in his hands that was now being handed over to the public without him being able to change anything about the content, talk me out of publishing it, or at least somehow earn money from it and get a mention. The rest of the conversation was noticeably more reserved or sober, but not unfriendly. My wife at the time, Renate, served coffee and cake, and we chatted about the topics and this and that. At the end, he asked if he could take the book with him, so that he could possibly make suggestions for improvements for another edition. I was concerned about the matter and was glad that he offered me this. I gave him the book and looked forward to some constructive criticism. But there was none. For a long time there was none. So I called him and inquired. And then it started. What I was imagining, that the photographs were all stolen and violated copyright and much more. He would pull my legs out from under me. My wife was listening on the phone and couldn't believe her ears. It became grotesque and silly when he said it was simply outrageous to write something that he himself had been working on for decades and that he wanted to publish and now couldn't because his publisher said it had already been published and the market wouldn't support another book. At first I didn't realize what he was talking about, because his topic and mine couldn't be further apart. Anything he said related to this one chapter 15 of my book. The lives of individual triplanes, a chapter that I had only included for the sake of completeness. Manfred Thiemeyer was one of the historians I mentioned earlier. Those who are interested in the stories and the people around them, you have to give him credit for decades of approaching the descendants of former World War I fighter pilots, or even survivors, and interviewing them or obtaining photos from their family albums. His collection must be quite a collection, and he deserves respect and recognition for this, and I appreciate the preservation of his information through his actions. He had also given many of the photos he had collected to Alex Imrie, for instance, or others, to publish. Like so many, he didn't do it for the cause, but for the opportunity to make money from it, and that somehow failed to materialize in his life, or came up short in his eyes. Now, some young snob comes along and, well, it seemed to me that he suffered from the fact that his name was not publicized as he would have liked, or even as he was entitled to. I would have liked to have given him this space, but he was now offended. Instead of joining in and working together, he opted for confrontation. Well, just don't avoid a fight. All the photos that I published in my book back then came from my archive, which is now part of my museum's archive. The photographs came from all kinds of sources, and were all copyright-free because they were old. Apparently, there were also a few photos in my book that he took from relative families' albums and gave to others for publication. These were then copied here and there and passed on under the table. That's the way it is with published materials. Happens with my stuff all the time too. And that's how some of the photographs found their way to me. Under copyright law in Germany, only the photographer himself has the right to the photograph for 70 years, unless he publishes the image before this period expires, in which case the 70 years start again from date of publication. However, you have to be careful now. If you take an old photo and, for example, retouch a bird in the sky, then you as the artist obtain the copyright to this work, not to the object depicted or the original photograph itself. For this reason, it has been common practice for decades for book publishers to do such things. This way, they can always point the finger at these changes and the renewed copyright terms. At the end of the day, it's all about the money and the opportunity to make money from such things. Since the photos I use don't come from such sources, so you can't prove which publication what was possibly copied from. If so, Manfred Thiemeyer's accusation simply came to nothing. But in the phone call he wanted to build up pressure, because he mentioned these changes. He was also a graphics designer or something similar and knew all about manipulating photographs. He was so excited that he even deigned to say on the phone that he would be able to generate a whole fighter squadron of personal individual pilot markings as photo montages in such a sophisticated way that I wouldn't even notice. He meant that I would now row back somewhere out of sheer fear that such manipulations would also be noticed in the photos I used. Since then, no photo has been worth anything to me personally, and especially not if the name Thiemeyer is included. For me, he has shot himself in the foot with this. At the beginning I told you that I had bound each book individually, and that I had a certain personal relationship with each of them, and yet I gave him one to look at. I told him on the phone that I was sorry for his attitude, and that I wasn't interested in scale markings or pilot paintings at all, and that they weren't my topic and never had been. I was never interested in getting in his way with respect to publications, and that's why he should please pack up the book and send it back to me. I was grateful for the notes he had scribbled in. However, he immediately said that these notes were far too valuable and that he wouldn't dream of sending them to me to improve my work. Besides, he would need them in court if he were to prosecute me for copyright infringement. Believe it or not, the matter actually went to court, and Mr. Thiemeyer failed completely with this offended vanity. The telephone conversation I mentioned above was available as a recording. I explained to the judge that I had bound the books myself in a small edition of 50 copies only, and would like to have the one copy back, especially as the notes in it would be useful to me. Mr. Thiemeyer raged again, and the judge finally decided that Thiemeyer should at least pay the 120 marks for the book. There was no copyright infringement at all. Thiemeyer was crestfallen, received an invoice from me for the book and paid after the second reminder. Well, you just try. For me, the fish was cleaned. There are people like that. I exist too. Of course, it wasn't over for him. I think he still thinks he's in the right today. I don't even think he's morally right. In any case, since then he has always called me copycat in public, regardless of whether it was in forums or in personal conversations with third parties. I know from people who had dealings with him that he always had nothing good to say about me. The attempt failed miserably. I don't think anyone really remembers me as a copycat. Perhaps this little article will at least help Mr. Thiemeyer to have created something that people might remember in connection with his name. I wish him well. I find it very unfortunate that competent people sometimes show such lapses.